It's actually
sounds like something you guys do.
remarkably familiar.
Yeah.
But there you go. Like, great. Glad someone's
Yeah.
paying attention. I mean,
Welcome once again to Chill Filter, to the podcast where we drink whiskey so you don't have to. But you probably should, and you probably are, and that's why we like you guys. Very special episode this week. We do like to do interview episodes every few episodes, and we got a very special guest today. He is a distiller. He is a whiskey guy in general, and he just wrote a book. And so we'll get to all that in a moment. But before we do, let's talk about some business. Hit us up on Instagram. Check us out on Patreon. Patreon is patreon.com/chillfiltered. And our Instagram is chillfiltered podcast. And that's ways you can support us. We like when you reach out. We like when you ask questions. We like when you join in on our fun. So hit us up there. And that's the business for this week. Like I said, we got a very special guest today, Colin Spoelman. Did I pronounce that right?
mm-hmm.
Sweet. Colin is the dude behind, or at least one of the dudes, but probably one of the main dudes behind Kings County Distillery in Brooklyn, New York. The oldest whiskey distillery in New York, actually, which is pretty cool. So, Colin, how are you doing today?
Good.
Wait,
New York City.
Give us the caveat.
Sometimes New York City.
No, I like
versus
that.
New York State, but yeah. We've
great.
been around in our 14th year, so we can claim some traction. Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Now I know you got started originally distilling in your own apartment or house or something.
Yeah, it's true.
Tell us about the evolution here.
I do have one of these very early homemade apartment batches.
Oh, wow.
That's so cool.
That's how that was in the mason jar era.
Nice.
So I grew up in Kentucky and would travel back to Kentucky, and I pretty soon realized living in New York City that people were interested in bourbon, but also in moonshine, and that I had special access as a Kentuckian to both, actually. And so kind of the evolution of Kings County really did kind of come about because I was tracking people's interest in not just bourbon, but really the sort of farm to table culture of restaurants in the city that was pushing away from sort of the mainstream commercial bourbon towards things like moonshine, that kind of older folk tradition that was behind the early days of bourbon, but also which bourbon had long ago given up. I mean, and as a person who very quickly sort of learned about, I did not learn about bourbon in high school or elementary school in Kentucky.
Some people have, yeah.
But there was this assumption that, like, I knew all about fried chicken and bourbon. I was like, okay, this is what people want from me. I'm gonna understand bourbon. But as I did, I became very disillusioned with it. And because it had become so corporate and industrial, and that all of this small batch marketing, was really a little bit of a, hard to take, because there wasn't a whole lot of small distilling. This is, 15 years ago. And so that's what got me interested in, well, let me just go completely sideways and start making like home brewing in my apartment and sharing that with friends, and kind of, you can get anything from any culture anywhere in the world in New York City, but this, moonshine was something that was genuinely fascinating to people, and kind of ticked that box of, this is the older tradition of bourbon whiskey. This is before rye whiskey, there was moonshine. And so it was, fun to share that with people, not really with the thought of starting a commercial distillery, but it is illegal to do all that.
100%.
So there was a moment where it was kind of like, I could keep doing this, or I could just find a way to do it legally. And the way to do it legally is to get a distiller's license. So my thought was, I'm just going to rent this little teeny space and take my apartment still and go over there and just do, kind of as a hobby business and see where it goes, and it was in that era where online commerce hadn't really taken off. I mean, it's kind of quaint to think about the beginning of those kinds of businesses that sort of sprung up with the internet and with e-commerce, really. I mean, this is like, again, 15 years ago. And so I kind of understood that there was a way to do this at a very small scale and not necessarily jeopardize my day job, which was in an architecture firm. And I really liked my day job. I was pretty happy with it. Yeah. Not a lot of like growth, I should say, in that, but at the same time, this sort of hobby distilling really, once I realized that New York State had changed the license fee to about $128, it was really like, you could start a commercial distillery with $25,000, and that covers all the equipment and all the licensing and all the legal filing, just everything, soup to nuts. Yeah. And so that's really how the business started. And so, I saw a very stark contrast with something like Bardstown. I mean, they were out of the gate with like a $10 million facility and
huge,
it's just totally different approaches to starting a brand and a business. But at the same time, ours really was focused on a different thing, which was always, let's be first in the beginning, it was let's be moonshine. And that's its own sort of authentic story. But then if you start to age that kind of moonshine that we were making, it becomes the kind of bourbon that existed in the 1800s that every big brand wishes that they were, for all the dates from the 1700s and the 1800s that are on bourbon bottles. Nobody's bothering to use a pot still to make those whiskeys. Nobody's actually backing up any of that marketing with actual process changes. It's still the same column distillate, the same 3-recipe bourbon, recipes that end up in every single product they make. Yeah. And so this is the thing that was deeply disillusioning, is that Kentucky bourbon had gotten to the point where the barrels were so generic. They were literally designed to be interchangeable brand to brand. And as a consumer, I was like, this flies against everything that whiskey should be. It should be singular and authentic, and one distillery should not taste like another distillery.
Totally.
And there was that moment where it's like, you could serve me a Buffalo Trace or a Woodford Reserve or, Four Roses small batch. And I don't know a person alive who could in a blind test tell you, which was which without a little prompting,
Right.
Totally.
And I think that's still kind of the case. I mean, maybe at this point I could probably pick out the Buffalo Trace, but
that's why Cole was nodding earlier. He was like, yeah, I know that Buffalo Trace.
Right. But I mean, there wasn't a lot of specificity within bourbon that I felt like it deserved. As a Kentuckian, I was like, if this is the cultural heritage of American whiskey, like, Kentucky should step up and do better. And to some extent, there are some great distillers in Kentucky who are doing what Kings County is doing in New York, but doing it for Kentucky. And so that's really exciting to see. But it remains to this day that I think most of the consumer enthusiasm in American whiskey is still for this kind of very, what I would argue, boring, very not super differentiated. Yeah. I mean, okay, you could differentiate it on the age statement and the proof. Yeah. So you get people chasing age statements and you get people chasing high proof whiskeys. Yeah. And it's like, guys, there could be more. There's a bigger, broader world out there. But, it wasn't a world that I could know until I had really become a distiller and started to tinker with a lot of the levers that you have as a distiller, as opposed to if you are really just operating a commodity factory and then you have these, kind of 3 different recipes that you're constantly sort of manipulating into different tiers of brands.
Right.
over
As
and over
minimally
again.
as possible so that you don't have to change up much of your production.
Right.
And,
Right.
Totally.
Earlier, you mentioned the original idea for the brand was to be moonshine. What prompted you to start aging, and did you just suddenly realize, like, dang, this is actually pretty good when you started aging, or what?
Well, I still would argue that there's no inherent betterness to an aged whiskey versus a moonshine. And if you look at tequila, it's not like there's an inherent betterness for a reposado or an añejo versus a silver tequila. In fact, some silver tequilas, people are spending $250 on silver tequila, which I find absolutely fucking ridiculous.
Yeah.
But that there is a culture that has, and a tradition that accepts the white spirit that we don't have in the United States. And that is because laws have sprung up to protect established distillers who want the laws to preserve the betterness of aged whiskey, when in fact, every culture in the world, whether you're talking about white rum or grappa or eau de vie, the unaged version of a spirit is often sold. Yeah, maybe it's a little bit more fiery. Maybe it's a little bit more, it has a slightly different use case, perhaps, than the aged whiskeys. But it's not necessarily, and it's more widely available, which makes it sort of inevitably less expensive or less precious. But and we did a really good business off of just the moonshine. And so, but once, I would say it wasn't necessarily that we were pursuing aged whiskey because, number one, we knew the market was eventually going to be an aged whiskey. But there was also a curiosity as a distiller, like, sure, it's one thing to make a great 0-year whiskey. If you make the best 0 whiskey in a lineup of, unaged products, what will happen in 2 years? What will happen in 4 years? What will happen at the 10-year mark, which we're about to find out? So, that, or let's say, I know what happens at the 10-year mark, but we haven't rolled it out necessarily. But that has generally been what has been driving some of the age-stated things. And then the question was also just like, if you're going to be doing age-stated whiskeys, don't stop at 4. There were a lot of, when we got started, there were a lot of whiskeys that's like, the day it turns 4, it's done. And that's never really been our approach. It's always been like, let's taste it, and if it tastes good, we'll pull it. And that over time has depended on a lot of other factors like barrel size and where it has aged and a lot of things. But we've also been gravitating to larger format barrels and more traditional aging timeframes. So most of our whiskeys are 4+ years. But
now you said you know what happens, or you will know what happens at the 10-year mark. Now I can proudly say that I know what happens at the 9-year mark, because I actually I got to come to Kings County on in December last year. I did a little tour and everything, and shout out to Hannah and the Distillery cat,
nice.
Harold.
Black cat,
anyway, I got to try the 9-year 164 proof. The most mouth-drying experience I've ever had in my entire life. It was so unique. It was very impressive and incredible, but it was something else.
That's crazy.
I mean, that is exactly the example of, when you're talking about 0-year whiskey and 2-year whiskey, when you get now we're at 9-year whiskey. It is that specific barrel is a great example of like, no, it doesn't get more similar to Kentucky. It just stays on its own bizarre but very cool path.
We had a write-in from a buddy of mine, Benny J, and he was curious. Will you get to the point where you'll sell crazy hazmat things like that to the public, and rather than just bar only?
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll first of all say like not every hazmat barrel is good. So, you know, I'm sure we can sell you hazmat whiskey. And
Hey, I asked while I was there, and they said no. there were only like
well,
12 bottles of that, weren't there?
Yes, I mean, actually, I will
Wow.
say, even just coming up in June, on the 9th, we're having a yard sale, and there's a trove of hazmat bottles that we're going to go to a private barrel buyer, but for whatever reason that is still sort of unclear, and I'm not even being coy about this or marketing they were literally returned to us. So
what?
Yeah, no, it's like great. I don't know.
Burning bridges. Jeez.
I'm sure you can get rid of them.
No,
Yeah.
it's fine. It's fine. It's fine. It's
Yeah.
for the best. It's for the best.
Yeah.
So yes, we will, as we have them, have more of those things, but also, you know, there's a layer of only if they're good and only if they, you know,
Yeah, you wanna, yeah.
So a lot of
will that be online? Because I'm like super curious.
It won't be online.
That's fly to Brooklyn, baby.
Yeah.
yeah, sure.
But yeah, I mean, we did one earlier this year. We put it online, and it was, you know, it was a barrel, so and it was an old barrel, so it was kind of a low fill thing, and that means we have about 80 bottles, and half of those we sell online, half of those, you know, I mean, it's sold out in 30 seconds. So
sure.
It can be very hard to disseminate fairly, other than just to say make the trip to the distillery. So here's the opportunity. Hazmat whiskey, June 9th. It's a 7-year. I don't know exactly the proof, but it's above the 140 threshold. So yeah.
So cool. to give you guys a little praise, and I don't know if our listeners caught this yet, but you know, you started with moonshine, which says something. Especially, you brought up Bardstown Bourbon Company, and so the thing about Bardstown, they put buttload of money into their distillery, buttload of money into their, you know, starting their distilling process. But the fact is they sourced for years, and they still do source partially, not all their stuff. But the fact is that Kings County started with unaged spirit and continued to just throw it in barrels at that point. I mean, there's probably a better way to put it, but you guys don't source. You guys have started from the bottom, worked your way up from unaged, selling well in New York with unaged, and it's, you know, it's to be lauded to say that you guys have never sourced. You guys have built everything from literally like the liquid up, you know, and I respect that a lot. And we've only done, I believe we've only done, I don't know if we've ever done a full episode on Kings. No, we've done at least one, I think. But we also did what we call a drink along, where we basically get some of our Patreon people to get samples of one specific bottle. We'll drink along with them. Yeah. And I remember talking about that and just thinking, you know, Kings County is actually doing something really cool. And I'm not a hater on sourcing, but I am a respecter on distillers that don't source at all.
I'm prepared to hate on sourcing if you're not, because only because, like, I'm also like a, you know, I'm an Appalachian, so I just don't believe in paying more money for something that you shouldn't pay more money for. And I'll say this, actually. I do think blending is something that's not necessarily very appreciated from the consumer perspective. So to some extent, the blender is a very important piece of the puzzle. And whether or not that's, it's not to segue or anything, but you know, whether or not the NDP or the brand has somebody on staff who's really capable and really good at doing that. To some extent, that makes a huge difference. But I also, at the same time, you know, am a distiller, and I tend to be far more interested in distillers than I am in brands. You know, a brand is an entity to make money, to exploit, you know, consumers' preferences for their own gain. Whereas a distillery, you know, it's a factory. It's out to make a product. It's out to make a good product.
Yeah, there's also craftsmanship in it.
Totally.
Yeah. And there's craftsmanship all the way through, which is what's so exciting about something like Bottled and Bond. Not to jump around too much, but like the it was really cool to see people really get into bottled and bond, because it is the thing that the brand cannot do. Only a distiller can make.
That's
a
true.
bottled
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
And one distilling season.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as you so smoothly brought us into the
Yes.
blended category here, the first thing we'll drink today here, why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah. So this is our, in many ways, the most recent of our aged whiskeys to come out. And it was a little bit because we started with 200 milliliter bottles, these little bottles up here, which we were selling for, around $23, which equates to, an $80 bottle on the shelf. And when we came out with a $7.50 of our bourbon, it was a $75 bourbon, which is in the old days was a lot to ask of people.
Totally.
Now maybe it's everybody else is like, oh, Kings County is selling this, for $75. We can crank the price on this undifferentiated 4-year MGP to the same level.
Yeah.
So, there you go. But we also, part of what we want to highlight is that we do really believe that we make good distillate at a younger age. And also understand that like moonshine is not going to be for everybody. Totally. And so could we make a product in the realm of like Irish whiskey, or even like a Maker's Mark profile, where it's not necessarily an oak bomb, it's not a proof, a high proofer, that's really out for the sort of casual. You could mix it if you wanted, you could sip it if you wanted. So that was the idea behind the blended bourbon. This is a $45 bottle on the shelf as a $7.50. So yeah, it's price competitive, certainly. But also it's kind of pushing away from Kentucky bourbon. And blended bourbon is this odd category that's in the TTB regs. It's blended whiskey. We obviously know if most people worldwide are drinking any whiskey at all, they're drinking blended Scotch, or blended Canadian whiskey. But blended bourbon is a subcategory within the US regs for 51% bourbon, straight bourbon, or I think it's straight bourbon. It's either bourbon or straight bourbon, and then the rest of it can be whatever you want. So it could be neutral spirit if we wanted. It could be whiskey that we source from Kentucky. We use all of our in-house spirit, but it's in a percentage. We're using some rye that we made. We're using some single malt that we made. Pretty much any of our house whiskey that's crossed the 2-year mark is sort of up for it. The average age tends to be closer to 3, and we put a hang tag that will let you know exactly where everything comes from. So
that's cool.
Nice. If you have a bottle, there's all the transparency sort of.
Love that.
Yeah, I did notice on the 200 milliliter bottle here, it does say age 2 years or more. So there is no new make blended into this. This was all past the 2-year mark, like you said.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. The bottle that I have, there's some corn whiskey, some bourbon, rye. There's some both 53 gallon straight bourbon, and then some smaller format, older bourbon for flavor. There's some rye, and there's some single malt.
Nice.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I'd never heard of that previously.
Yeah, me neither.
Well, that's the thing. It's really like not a category that a lot of people are looking at. And I guess I would say one thing that Kings County has by design or not by design often done is that we get interested in something as distillers, and then very often the big guys are like, oh, so 2 years after we had a moonshine out on the shelves in New York City, then there's a Jack Daniel's unaged whiskey that was pretty easy to come by. There's a bonded whiskey. Jack Daniel's had a bonded whiskey.
Yeah.
It's like
just keep an eye on Brooklyn.
I would not be shocked if more people turn to blended bourbon. Number one, because I think after people go super flavor forward, there is always in the history of American whiskey, there's a return to lighter bodied whiskeys. So I think we're a little ahead of the market in that regard. But it'll be interesting to see if other people kind of get into the flexibility of blended bourbon, the sort of inherent lighter profile that it can suggest.
Yeah.
Also,
I
people
have a feeling.
may also be getting more price sensitive about bourbon. So
Totally.
that may head that direction too.
I have a feeling that Jack Daniels would be like, all right, unaged, sure. And then they're like, bottle and bond, sure. And then you're like, bourbon. And they're like, crap. Tennessee whiskey brand.
Right.
Very against using bourbon.
I know. And yet it's been cool to watch I actually love what they're up to at Jack Daniels, especially lately.
Yeah,
as they have basically put out a fair number of really excellent bourbons, posing as Tennessee whiskeys and just saying to people, if you if you like bourbon, we can do that too.
Oh,
that's what this would be if we did that. So
they've been doing great stuff out there. Yeah, it seems like
it took them a while to figure it out, but
I mean, they were selling, sure, but they weren't selling to the whiskey connoisseurs for a while. Now they definitely are.
Yeah, they definitely are. I'd love to give listeners some impressions of what this tastes like. So now on the nose, I'm getting like a mustiness and kind of like a barnyard funk. Like this has some funkiness to it that I can like really appreciate. And the thing that I'm not getting on this at all is like a stingy youth that you would associate with a 2-year. This is the proof point is spot on. I feel like 43% does really well here, and there's a sweetness on the back end too. It gets a little sweet after the kind of barnyard funk and right on the landing there. So I for 2 years plus, I think that this really punches above its weight.
Mm-hmm.
Great nose. When I first even smelled from the bottle, I was like, that is caramel central. From the nose, really nice and sweet throughout. Even on the finish, it's got a nice sweetness. I think caramel is there. It's not as potent as the nose on the palate and the finish. Really well-rounded palate. Like I said, sweet caramel, a little bit caramel. Definitely malty though. More than I would expect of something labeled bourbon, which is good. I don't hate on that. I think it's actually really unique in that way. So I like it.
Yeah.
So out of curiosity, when you are curating this blend for your blended bourbon, what are you trying to achieve? What's your planned outcome with this?
Right. Well, first of all, I should say this is Ryan and Nathan who are actually doing the blending. So
cool. Gotcha.
I'll speak for them. Well, I think it's been a little bit of an evolution. This is now batch 4, I think.
That's what's on the label.
That we're on. Again, they're looking for that balance between approachable and yet mature. I mean, it should be past the sort of moonshiny stage, but not yet into the sort of very holiday spice characteristics that we get from some of our older whiskeys. So it's really about like vanilla, caramel, honey. There's a lot of actually used barrel whiskeys in here, one way or another, whether we're talking about single malt whiskeys or we're talking about corn whiskey. And that tends to foreground like honey and hay and grassy characteristics, but not necessarily immature characteristics.
Totally.
Exactly. It's that sort of Scotch whiskey thing where it's got a very different, if you were to try a Scotch whiskey next to a bourbon, you would say, oh, it's lighter bodied, but it's not a reflection of maturity. So that's kind of the game that we're playing within bourbon, is to push it more towards that sort of Scotch style of maturity, which has a lot to do with the cooperage, the used cooperage.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
Also malt, you were right to foreground malt. So all of our bourbon is 20% malt. It's a high malt bourbon. And then we're having both high malt bourbon, high malt rye, and then some single malt in there actually. So
that's cool.
On a pound for pound basis, the malt is probably 30% of this, which is much more substantial than any other American whiskey that isn't a single malt. With
your malt whiskey, are are you typically aging that in used barrels? Are there any specific used barrels? If so,
Just our own used bourbon barrels.
That's cool.
So yeah, no, or I guess occasionally a rye barrel or a peated bourbon barrel, but our own cooperage that we're just reusing for practicality. And we don't use new barrels for second.
That's interesting. With do you ever do like wine barrels or anything like that? I noticed not a lot of your stuff had like port or sherry or anything like that.
Right. Yeah, we tend to do whiskey flavored whiskey.
Totally. Yeah, I like that.
I mean, I just think in a way, a lot of that stuff is people trying to dress up against source whiskey. Like
that makes sense.
This appealing. Now,
trying to differentiate.
Yeah, the analogy to Scotch is a good one, and I think in Scotland there is. If we were exclusively focused on used barrel whiskeys, I think we would probably play a lot more. As it stands, the used barrel whiskeys that we do, again, it's practical to reuse our own barrels. So that's really the main argument for it. And the reason we have played with it. We've done some wine finished. We've done some Applejack finished whiskeys, but and I think we could build a business off of that. But
totally,
I just see it as being so focused on distillate as the determiner of our brand and the product.
Yeah.
I haven't seen a lot of need for it, to put it sort of that way. That. Yeah. I mean, if we did a little bit more in the used barrel space, and I think that's kind of interesting to do bourbon recipe and used barrels, there would be some opportunity for it. But the market, again, this flavor profile of the blended bourbon, most bourbon drinkers are not quite here. I mean, it's a lovely whiskey for sure, but I will also say, a lot of people will say this is a cocktail whiskey, or this is a Boilermaker whiskey, or it's a session whiskey.
I hear you.
Now, you said in this experiments that you've done, you could probably build a business off this. I've seen your wall of experiments.
That's right.
And you could probably build several businesses on all these experiments that you've done. You guys clearly, I took a picture of this wall while I was there. And just to call out a couple, these were my favorites. So there's a beet moonshine. There was one that said pumpkin on it. There was sweet potato. There was rose geranium infused moonshine, and there was one that just said John's ...
Right.
So tell me about those experiments. What's up with that?
Well, I think, certainly a lot of those are actually unaged whiskeys that are infusions or designed to be sort of, when a lot of people come to the distillery, they don't like whiskey, and if you can give them something that they come home with, like a chocolate whiskey or a coffee whiskey, that's really cool, because you've connected to that person who thought they didn't like whiskey, and yet they do. And in the beginning, that wall was really sort of when there are flavors that you want to. It was kind of the archives in the beginning, just flavors that we wanted to remember. That bottle of. There's a couple bottles that were questionable because there was a bottling machine. You're going to hear everything. There was a bottling machine, and there was a piece broken on it, but you could jam a pen into it, and it would work totally fine. It was a pneumatic. But then one day, one of the interns had it, and it was just leaking ink into the.
Oh no!
And I was like, okay,
whiskey.
Yeah, separate that out. That's bad. I think it just ended up on that shelf. So, but yeah. So I mean, certainly we have built our sort of. We're never going to win on price or age, so let's be creative. And I think that it defines our business for sure.
Yeah,
at every aspect, at every stage. So, and again, I think it works to some extent, because you do see a lot of the bigger distillers taking up ideas that we've embraced and we've taught consumers to believe in, like bonded whiskey, or even I think American single malt is not a Kings County thing necessarily, but it is a thing that craft distillers really built, and the Jack Daniel's single malt and Bullet single malt are coming to the table for it. So, and in turn are building business back for the craft distillers.
Nice.
So,
Have there been any of those experiments that have turned into a product that you guys ended up bringing to the core line?
Well, certainly the peated bourbon is probably the best example of that.
Oh, I have one of those right here.
Why don't we pour that now?
Well, before we go to peated bourbon, because I actually think it's better to go to the straight bourbon next.
Let's do it.
But save that thought, because it is true that a lot of our even the regular bourbon, it's a high malt bourbon. There's only 2 ingredients: it's corn and malted barley, which already is a pretty unusual recipe. Already is the result of we're playing with rye, but it's sort of fussy to work with. We can use wheat, but it's just like doesn't add that much flavor. So ultimately, this high malt recipe made a lot of sense when we weren't counting pennies of malt is more expensive. It was really just like, here's a really versatile, good recipe that no commercial distiller would ever do, because the malt is the most expensive grain piece of it. So most mash bills have 5% malt, maybe up to 10% malt. So that was really the genesis of this straight bourbon. So it's 80% New York State organic corn, and it's 20% English malted barley.
Nice.
That is Golden Promise, which is a somewhat obscure varietal, but is a Scotch whiskey cultivar.
Nice.
It has a lot of diastatic power, so it's useful for making whiskey. Some brewers in the United States had found it, and were using it to make like Scotch ales and high proof whiskeys, high proof beers rather. And so we had access to this kind of whiskey malt, even though there isn't a whole lot of that in the US. So
that's cool. And this one's at least 3 years.
It's actually a 4 year.
Okay, cool.
The label says 3. It keeps coming up that I keep having to explain. It's actually a 4 year, but we're keeping the labels. I think the blenders are worried they're gonna have to go, they have a thin batch and they have to use a flavor forward 3-year-old.
Gotcha.
But any of the recent 2 or 3 batches that we've done have actually been 4 year.
Yeah.
And
now
on the top end, it's a 6 year. So it's an average 5 year.
Oh, that's cool.
Nice.
Yeah.
Now this is, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is a product where you'll have batches of cask strength of this, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
No. Well, let's say it's the same mash bill and the same barrel set that ends up as the barrel strength. Okay. But I would not characterize it necessarily as the same whiskey, but barrel strength. Because we tend to hold really sort of more oak forward whiskeys for the barrel strength. The barrel strength is it's for barrels that are not quite as balanced as end up in the straight bourbon. Okay. So it's one of the reasons why I think our barrel strength has become really popular, is because it is, it's pretty heavy on the oak, and it's really flavorful, and it's really high proof often. So it's that sort of combination of a very flavorful thing that is then even more concentrated because it's so high proof. It really does become sort of experiential in a way that this is designed to be a really classic, profile bourbon, even though it's pot distilled, so it has more viscosity. It has a sort of like thicker texture than a Kentucky bourbon, and it's got more malted barley. So it's a little bit more in the sort of direction of Scotch whiskey or Irish pot still whiskey in its mash bill, but then it's aged like a bourbon. So, and it's pot distilled. So you have a few different components coming together to, even though it is kind of a classic profile, it's got a lot of differentiating features.
Yeah. Now I'm willing to go out on a ledge here for a strike 2 for me for not understanding things correctly.
Yes. Okay. Sorry.
So anyway, just because I want to know, I'm like, I'm pretty science focused and I want to know. Is it that you have made the same, you said same mash bill, and you have many barrels. Do you select certain barrels that are more oak forward, like you said, to batch, and that's a batch of cast strength, and then the rest get proofed down for that? I do understand that it's not the same, and that it doesn't start in one big vat and then you batch it. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Actually, we've been talking about whether or not it makes sense to do a sort of like cask strength. We call this our flagship, but a cask strength straight bourbon, which would then be different from what we have established in the market as our barrel strength bourbon, because there is a internal perception difference in those barrels, and that might lead to a sort of a little bit less intense barrel strength whiskey, but still would have a lot of the characteristics that make our barrel strength really popular. You know, so is there a way that we can sort of split the difference? And that would be as simple as just taking the first 10 cases out of the flagship tank before we proof it down. That could be this kind of new product, which, so I'll say, everything is, it's not a lot of secrets around Kings County. So everything is kind of in conversation and development. But and one other little difference is that usually the barrels that go into the barrel strength are in fact not just oak forward, but they tend to be rejected for flagship. So they'll sit longer until they become interesting. So there is an older age statement on average of the barrel strength.
Very cool.
Our most recent barrel strength was a 5-year. I mean, it's not a huge difference from a 4-year, but the average age of that 5-year will go all the way up to 7-8 years.
Wow.
And the average age is somewhere in between. So so it's both barrels that are more oak forward, and then they tend to be sort of set aside, and then only later they'll be brought in to become the barrel strength.
Gotcha. Cool.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty interesting that, you know, we've talked to a few distillers or blenders on the podcast, and a lot of the ones we've talked about don't focus so much on the like initial product. And what I mean by that is the unaged distillate. And it's really cool to hear you talk about like the importance of good distillate more than anything. Like aging, you know, aging's good. Like I agree, aging's great. But
most of those guys don't have access to good distillate.
Yeah.
I mean, they
as
have
someone from
to,
Eastern
like,
Kentucky.
No, I mean they have access. They have access to like the baseline distillate, which would never change. It's designed never to change. And you know, I think that's a missed opportunity for a lot of these distillers, which makes it interesting when they do start to go in that direction of let's do some custom mash bills. Let's do some things that we can do as distillers that the secondary, or what I'll call the commodity market, not the secondary market, but the commodity market, just won't have access to. And that should be our competitive advantage as distillers, the ability to make that kind of stuff. But I think in our case, it really is a twofold approach. It's obsessive attention to detail on the distillate, and then it's obsessive attention to detail on the blending. And I think it's hard to find an American distillery that does both, because often you'll have, you know, well, I mean, it's not to say they're not obsessive about their distillate, but I'd be happy to consult with them to find ways to spend a lot more money on their distillate to make it better. Right. If they're interested in that, I can tell them exactly how to do it.
So I'll talk about a little bit of the notes I'm getting from the straight bourbon,
because I'm about finished with mine.
I'm closing in. This one, especially on the palate, is one of the most dark chocolatey whiskeys I've had. Normally when I say chocolatey, I think malty, maybe a little underaged. But this one is like more dark chocolatey, which leads me to believe, it's not underage. I think this is a solid age, but also it's got this. It's not like comparing the first to the second, the blended bourbon to the straight bourbon. Very much caramel on the first one. This one is nice chocolate. If the peated bourbon has pretzel notes, we'll just have a full turtle going down.
Yeah.
And but I dig it. I much prefer the straight bourbon just because of the depth of it. It's definitely a little more depth. I dig it.
Yeah, I definitely got more of a buttery, I think a thicker mouthfeel. I got a little more of obviously classic bourbon notes, but the butteriness that it was just richer overall. It was a richer experience. And it did leave me, I'm a higher proof guy. It did leave me, very curious and interested in the cast strength version. I will say though, I was at the distillery. When I was at the distillery, I was like, okay, whichever bottle I like the most, I'll get that one. And I was like, I'm learning about what you have, and I'm like, okay, there's a cast strength bourbon, there's a cast strength rye, I'll whatever it is, whichever one I like the most, I'll just get one bottle. So naturally I walked out with 2 bottles. but I did get the cast strength rye, and I decided to opt for the peated single malt because it impressed me the most. It was so unique, and it just like stood out from the pack as like, this is a very interesting bottle to own.
Well, thank you for that. That is I agree with you. I think it's the best thing that we make.
Nice.
I think it's the thing that shows our abilities the most.
That's cool.
The market for American single malt is, it's a fraction of rye, and rye itself is a fraction of bourbon.
Absolutely.
So, we do a week of single malt production every year.
That's cool.
Week. Yeah.
It's like Pete Week. Balcony.
Right.
Yeah.
So speaking of, market share and general interest in things, one of the things you mentioned in your book is that when you started putting down barrels in your first year, you put down 20 barrels of rye in your first year. And you said the market demand for bourbon was 50 times greater than for bourbon than for rye. So I was curious, were you also putting down, 50 times more bourbon barrels, or substantially more bourbon barrels, or
it is kind of still the case that we basically do 45 days of rye. We do a week of single malt, and the rest of it is either bourbon or peated bourbon.
Wow,
that's cool.
So that tells you it's basically 10 months of bourbon, a month and a half of rye, and then some miscellaneous days. So and I think we want to make it that we were doing more rye. I think that's the future opportunity of a Northeastern distillery. Let's say if people really want to invest in geography and they want to believe that bourbon should come from Kentucky, then they must also buy their rye from Pennsylvania and New York. Because get rid of all your bottles that are rye distilled in Kentucky. If you can't have it both ways. You can't.
Rye can't grow well in Kentucky compared to northern states.
Well, and even still, a lot of the Kentucky distillers, when they took over making rye, they did it only to be able to use the legal designation. But there's a lot of corn in there. It's all column distillate versus what rye used to be, which was pot or 3-chamber still, or there was a lot of technicality that went into rye that's long gone, that's completely lost. It's something I say in the book, but there's no continuity of rye production in the United States. There's no distiller making it today that made it 80 years ago.
I mean, even Old Overholt has changed the recipe over the years.
Well, the brain's been gobbled up too.
It was made in Eastern Pennsylvania, and then at some point moved to Beam and has been made in Beam for more than 40 years.
Right.
So Michter's was really the last of the old school distillers, and they closed in the 90s. So every brand of rye has been reformulated in Kentucky. Maybe it's the same mash bill, maybe it's not. And it's interesting to see Beam coming out with what their latest sort of I think it's an Overholt sort of spinoff, but it's a
A Overholt or whatever.
Yeah, it's
Mm-hmm.
Monongahela rye, which is 80% rye and 20% malted barley.
Hey,
It's actually
that sounds like something you guys do.
remarkably familiar. Yeah, but there you go. Like, great, glad someone's paying attention. I mean, I would prefer maybe a little less specificity on the geography, which is usually a TTB no to use geographic indicators when you're not distilling in that place. But
Interesting.
Yeah,
it's like saying something's a Kentucky bourbon outside of Kentucky.
Right. If we used like a bluegrass style Cumberland River bourbon made in Brooklyn, people would be like, "What the fuck?"
Yeah, exactly.
But they're like fully making a Monongahela style, Keystone rye in distilled in Claremont, Kentucky.
So let's talk. I've always wanted to ask a distiller this. I don't know why I haven't until this point, but it's the perfect segue, I guess. Can you malt corn? And if so, could you smoke malt corn?
Okay. Well, I believe there is a distiller that is smoke malting corn in Kentucky.
Yeah, I can't remember who it is either.
I don't know whether the name escapes me, but
100% heard of it. I know that somebody malts corn.
That's cool.
Yeah, I mean, well, I don't know if they're malting the corn as they're smoking it. They might just be smoking their corn. But yes, you can malt corn for sure.
Okay.
And I don't even think it would be commercially complicated to execute. You know. Yeah. I mean, that's part of it. Is just if you're a malting company, you're going to focus on what does the business. Yeah. And I've never heard of malted corn being used in a commercial product aside from that Western Kentucky place. So it would be interesting to try to do that. Yeah, MB Roland. Yes, thank you.
That's what it is. Okay, cool. Yeah, shout out to a few of our listeners who love MB Roland. Marco and John Hughes. So
nice.
Nice. Yeah.
Well, speaking of listeners, let me shout out here Ben Klepsig. Naturally, we give a shout out just about every episode. But so Ben wrote in and he's curious. Earlier in the episode, you said you mentioned your barrel sizes. Ben is curious if you can talk about the role of smaller versus larger aging barrels specific to your company and like which will always have a place, which way are you headed? What do you guys typically do?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we early on became known as a small barrel whiskey company because that's the whiskey that was released first. Because when you if you fill a 10, a 15, and a 53, your 10-gallon barrel is going to be due in about 2 years. Yeah. And your 53 is going to be due in 7 years. So for a long time, people were like, oh, they only use small barrels. We were filling all sizes of barrels. It's just that the smaller ones were better first. I have to, I don't want to say they were mature first. I don't want to say they were ready or finished. They just were better earlier. And so we started with, and also like in the beginning, we were using 8-gallon stills. So we would have 1.5 gallons of distillate per day. And then it was 3 gallons per day. So it just doesn't add up to 53s. And in fact, the oldest 53-gallon barrel that we have is 11 years old. So and we're a 14-year-old company. So it took us a little while to even get to 53s. So we started with a lot of 5s, gravitated to 10s and 15s. We did a few 30s early on, and actually for about 3.5 years did only 53s. And now we've started to put back in the 30s because we kind of miss both the small barrel cooperage heft, I mean, you're talking about like heft in the flavor that you have. Even the straight bourbon has small format barrels in it. So in the blend. So it's become kind of intrinsic to our flavor characteristic, and it's been a challenge as we have gravitated to beyond the small format, how to keep the same level of flavor without everything becoming a 10-year, 53-gallon bourbon. Because really, if you talk about a 5-gallon barrel at 2 years and a 10-gallon barrel at 3 years and a 15-gallon barrel at 6 years, these are all comparable to 12, 14, 18-year Kentucky bourbon.
Right.
So we don't have 18-year-old whiskey. So it's been a little bit like, let's do it through blending, but that means every batch is a little bit of a challenge. And so, but it's a challenge you sign up for as a small company, and we put a lot more, it's not a question of like tanking lots of barrels. It's let's take a little bit of this barrel and a little bit of this barrel and top it up with all of this barrel,
Yeah.
Now you said earlier, there's no secrets in Kings County, so I don't feel bad asking this question. Did any part of the decision to return to 30-gallon barrels have anything to do with an anticipated increase in demand in the next couple of years, or was it truly just a flavor profile choice?
Demand for small format barrels?
No, just demand for whiskey.
Demand for whiskey general.
I don't know where we're at on this roller coaster, but
no, because well, that's a good question. I mean, we're not making a lot of 30s right now, because it does appear that demand is perhaps not on the trajectory that it was.
It's coming down
three years ago,
right?
But that's not to say that I think, in general, I sort of perceive that we're making we're creating the sort of we're planting a garden, and in time we'll harvest that garden. And there's not a lot of thought to like, I mean, if we really wanted to expedite it, we could invest a lot in small format barrels, but then we're going back to a much higher cost of liquid. And I just don't know that like cranking back age statements is going to be appealing. I think we've, that would be also a big trade-off. So, no, I think it really is genuinely listening to the blenders who say they, really prefer to have the flexibility to draw from multiple formats. It's also different cooperages. So you're talking about one independent stave and then barrel mill, very different cooperages, slightly different flavor profile. So that's a piece of it too.
Nice.
That's cool.
I'm thinking we should move right along to this peated bourbon here. Yeah.
Peated bourbon.
Focus. There it is.
So peated bourbon, everybody knows or has a sense that peated Scotch whiskeys, peat is a kind of like, it's hard to describe. It's a fossilized sort of turf, vegetative material that is beginning to fossilize. And so it is a precursor to coal, and is burnable as fuel. So,
absolutely.
Fred.
It's like it's organic material that
and so common to a lot of Scotch whiskeys, different coal. Different Scotch whiskeys will use peat in the malting process. So it's in the old days, a lot of the Islay Scotches where there weren't a lot of trees on the island, peat was the source of fuel for kitchens and heat, and in the distilleries for their production processes, including kilning of malt. And so their whiskeys would just have a peaty characteristic. And so, again, we had access to some peated malt from the same malting company. And so we were using it for our single malt, and the distiller on duty, Rob, was like, we don't have any more of the Golden Promise, so I'm going to use the peated malt that we used to make single malt. We're going to use it to make bourbon. And I was like, okay. Sure.
I trust you.
Go for it.
Why not? Better to run the stills than not, right? I mean, that was the thought. And it just turned out really great, I mean, it just is very familiar. It's lightly peated, so people hear the word peated and they're like,
that's what I was going to say. The peat on the nose is way lighter than I was expecting.
Yeah.
Peat on the palate is like beautifully. It's like really toward the finish where you get the peat, and it's amazing.
And I even poured a smidge more of the bourbon back so I could compare the bourbon and the peated bourbon. And now that I've smelled peated bourbon and I'm coming back to the normal bourbon, I'm getting maple as like a mega nose note on the normal bourbon.
Let's smell that. Yeah, it's 100%. 100% maple. Like maple syrup. Yeah. I dig this. This might be my favorite pour yet.
Yeah, this is definitely like this sort of staff favorite. It's I mean, this, if you're into whiskey, you got to try this whiskey.
Yeah,
totally.
Nobody else. I mean, there are a few other peated bourbons, but it is exceedingly rare. And why would it be so rare when peated Scotch is as popular as it is?
Yeah.
And bourbon is as popular as it is.
Totally.
There's just, again, not that many big distillers are playing with mash bill. And so it's something we can do, have done. And now this is 10 years into the evolution of peated bourbon. And I would say we have it, it is dialed in. It is what it wants to be. And that's really cool.
I like it. Shout out to Dramhound here now too. So our buddy Dramhound says, I hate Scotch / peat, but your peated bourbon is phenomenal.
Yeah. I feel the same way. I don't really gravitate to Lafroig, but
I love peated whiskey.
But a little touch in bourbon, especially if it's really nicely made bourbon with a precise viscosity, that and a richness and a depth, it just adds. It's interesting actually to compare this to. There's some distillers that will take MGP and they'll put it in a Lafroig barrel.
Yeah,
right.
Totally different product.
Yeah,
I mean, interesting still, but not integrated in the way that this is. Which is designed to be the whiskey that it's going to be from start to finish.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
it's very good on the palate. I think it does depart from the normal bourbon a bit because of the peat, but like I do like peat in general, and so when I nosed it and there wasn't as much peat as I was expecting, I was like, oh, I don't know, but the peat came through on the palate a little more than the nose for me. The nose remains soft and very pleasant, very easy, a nice introduction to the peat. But then when you sip, you're like, there it is. Okay, I like that.
Right.
I heard you guys might be doing a peated rye. Is that right? Or like
we just actually did a distillery exclusive, pretty limited release. Actually, it's still available on the website.
I was checking that out last night.
Yeah,
I put it in my cart and everything. I woke up this morning and I got the marketing email that says, hey, you left something in your cart. So that was actually the number one thing I've been purposefully putting this off, because I'm dying to hear your take on this.
Yeah. Okay.
My mouse is hovering over
the
rye
guy
button.
for the record.
I'm ready. There's only 190 some bottles of this.
Yes. Cool. Okay. So peated bourbon is like, oh, that's cool. That's a really nice whiskey. Peated rye is like, you have never had a whiskey like this. It is very strange, but strange in like, oh my God. It's like when you try Scotch for the first time, you're like, what the fuck is that?
Yeah.
This does have that same kind of like, oh, I've never had anything like that. And yet it's totally amazing.
Yeah.
It takes the sort of barnyard funk, which is not necessarily a positive flavor note, but it is really what rye is meant to be. Like if you have a good rye, it should taste like you're inside a barn, a very old barn. There should be that sort of rye, nutty, almost like dill, blue cheese.
Yeah, man.
Just like a lot of just kind of bold,
tangy,
expressive, flavorful notes.
You're speaking Brian's language.
Yeah, added this like barbecue note to it, with a touch of like a savory, maybe a wisp of Scotch, but you wouldn't necessarily throw that in together. I don't know. And it's barrel strength, and I think it's a few barrels that are 4 years plus. It's a very cool whiskey.
That's cool.
Nothing like it I've ever had. There's some peated ryes out there. Again, I should give credit to Liberty Pole. They make a really good one.
Nice.
But why more people are not making this, I have no idea. But it's
cool.
It's really cool.
Yeah, nice. All right,
and there's only about 25 bottles left.
Oh, okay,
wow.
all right, hang on.
Quick, Brian.
So
Send me a sample, Brian.
I'm like, actually, so I am gonna tack on a peated bourbon too. How could I not?
Yeah.
But thank you very much, though. In addition to the samples, I mentioned that I forgot to get a tasting glass while I was there, and then you guys sent me one, so I appreciate that very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's awesome. Anything on the horizon?
Yeah.
Well, I do want to mention the book, which is not so much on the horizon, but just we are cresting.
Just got published though, or at least just got released.
It came out Tuesday of last week, and so that was really a great chance for me to really highlight the distillers. Again, I clearly have a perspective on American whiskey, and it's one that I hope more people adopt, because it is a perspective that is somewhat it is, if you step away from the marketing and the money and the sort of storytelling that has been drowning American whiskey and diluting American whiskey and ruining American whiskey, to be very precise about it. Let's go back into American whiskey, and let's go back into American whiskey 2024. That was also the thing, is I tasted through hundreds of whiskey for this book, which of course is like sort of professional curiosity and competitor analysis,
market research,
but also, sort of fun. I'm not gonna lie.
Right.
So there's that. But there were a lot of discoveries, which were, I had an impression of classic Kentucky bourbons that have, some of which have gone downhill, some of which have gone uphill, some of which have stayed the same, and that is a thing that is constantly happening in the background that people aren't tracking day to day. So there was an opportunity to revisit a lot of those things. And it was a focus on whiskeys that you can find pretty available. It wasn't, I'm not going to do a book on the Sazerac allocated portfolio. Other people can do that and obsess over that.
Too much material out on that already.
Right. I'm interested in finding the small, idiosyncratic, weird, cool, excellent, great value Kentucky bourbons or craft whiskeys that are just, there's just so much out there that you don't have to hunt for. And people are chasing the dumbest stuff. So can I just help some people find some good whiskeys? So that was a part of it. And just also, meeting the people and seeing the facilities, you just understand so much. So much. So I really think visiting distillers is as important as tasting whiskeys.
Totally. My favorite thing that I've come across so far in your book is I thought that the sentiment that you made was very interesting, that large brands began to try to market themselves as these like small batch, family owned, blah, blah, blah. So that later, when smaller distilleries came out that were truly small batch and they were family owned, the public sentiment about that was like peaked already. That brand is truly small batch and truly family owned. So it helped them out a lot. I thought that was cool.
And I think it's just something, I don't know if this has always been the case, but certainly you see it happening with single malt whiskeys. You see it happening with pot still Irish whiskeys. There is this broad sort of global thing happening in whiskey that does want the authenticity, the transparency, the truth of a finely made whiskey. And it's so difficult to attain. It just, whether you're talking about Scotch or Irish whiskey, because you're just denied access to so much, because if it is truly made well and small and carefully, you probably can't get it at the local store, If it's made for a giant audience, that's probably what you're easiest to find. And so the best thing to do is to go to the distillery. Most distillers will have a tasting room. They'll have the ability to sell directly to you, and they'll usually put their best stuff there, or at least they'll have something interesting there.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, that's a pro tip, and stop chasing the sort of stupid, what do you got behind the counter? Whatever you have behind the counter is the thing that's artificially allocated, not the thing that is truly allocated. And if they're not even themselves selling it in their distillery tasting room, then that is the best indication that it's artificially allocated. But if something is rare and a distillery wants people who are diehards to have first access to it, they're going to put it in the distillery. They're going to put it in the place that's easiest for them to explain to people what it is. Or what's important.
Yeah.
So
that's interesting.
Yeah.
Have you ever had Whiskey Del Bach products?
Oh yeah. They're in the book. I was actually got to go there for the ACSA board member retreat. Was in Tucson this year.
Yeah. So you probably met Mark.
I for sure met Mark. Yes, of course. Yep. And I know Stephen, the owner, and he kind of came to Kings County in the early days because he was was looking to. He was kind of like, I'm looking to do this over in Arizona.
That's cool. That's
but
he saw you guys as inspiration to an extent. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. But to see how their products have really come to, and also another thing that is discussed in the book is not terroir, which is a word that is maybe inappropriately applied to whiskey, but just regionality.
Right.
Yeah.
It
applies to you guys, and it applies to Tucson with this Whiskey Del Bach. Yeah.
This the map of American whiskey, or the map of French wine or Scotch whiskey. There's regions of French wine. There should also be regions of American whiskey, and
I agree.
We have the opportunity to figure out what those might be.
Yeah, I liked your proposed region map. Yeah,
right.
I like that.
We'll see if it gets adopted. But
So as I mentioned earlier, I'm a bit of a science guy, and there was one thing that really stood out for me. You mentioned something, and I will see if you have a specific example here for me, but whiskeys purportedly synthesized in a lab environment by engineers who claim to have replicated the chemical signatures of old whiskeys. Is this in reference to a particular thing? I genuinely don't know.
Oh, for sure. Yes, that is in reference to a very specific, multiple people have come out with, this is our rapid aged. Rapid aging has been around
speed age
as long as whiskey's been around. But the latest spin on rapid aging is not to call it rapid aging, but to call it you've matched the chemical signature of an old whiskey.
That's how you know it's good.
So what I would argue is like, sure, you can do that, but is that the test of whether or not something is the same? And the answer is no. The test of whether something is the same is if in a blind setting, controlled experiment, you can determine what is the outlier or not. And if the human palate cannot tell the outlier, then science has succeeded. But nobody will stake this claim of replicating the chemical signature on any sort of like field controlled study of the ability to determine in a triangle test of here's 2 old and 1 new, which is which, and nobody can figure it out. We're definitely not there yet. And I just also bristle at the notion that people even want that. Like,
I know.
We're not even drinking whiskey for the flavor, guys.
Yeah. Tell me more about these chemical signatures. This sounds delicious.
That's so funny. We're just drinking this because it was made when we were in high school, or it's actually, the story is so important to whiskey because it's all we have, I mean, it's just okay. We can talk about grain, we can talk about processes, but something about this very alchemical, elemental thing speaks to us because it's also the alcohol. But it's what gives the alcohol a little bit of beauty, a little bit of artistry, a little bit of a thing that isn't quite as stupid as I'm drinking my 40-ounce malt liquor.
Yeah.
It's an elevating characteristic, and so it can't really be cheated because that's not why we're in it. We're in it for the, for the fun of the history and the story. And so anyway, so I come out hard against that discipline, although not everybody, I think, is doing it in a sort of silly way. And actually, Brian Davis, who's in that category of sort of rapid agers behind Lost Spirits, which was first in Los Angeles and then just finished a run in Las Vegas, has always done it right. I mean, he's always been like, I'm a mad scientist. So you don't know what's going on in here. And that's kind of the fun of it, because there's also like, he's building the story around it that replaces the other story that would be there. Yeah. And so it tends to, he cracked it as far as I'm concerned. Cool. and actually makes really delicious whiskeys with whatever he's doing, ends up in an interesting place,
Yeah.
So
now we've probably saved the most important thing for last. Now, you have spearheaded a distinction of this Empire Rye notion. Now, I would love for you to educate the listeners here on what an Empire Rye is, and where we're at with this getting adopted by many other distilleries and things like that.
Right. So I should give credit. I was a skeptic of Empire Rye in the beginning, and it was really Nicole Austin's project when she was at Kings County, and really came about, I believe, in 2015. She attended the ACSA conference and the award ceremony, and was with a lot of the New York distillers. And there was a plan hatched that I had nothing to do with to come up with a New York specific style of whiskey, but that's maybe not the right word, because it was really just a mark of provenance. Like, it's a New York,
it's a distinction.
So if it is 75% from New York State grown rye grain in the mash bill, it's distilled in New York, and it meets the criteria for straight rye whiskey and enters the barrel at greater than 116, you can call it less than 116. You can call it Empire Rye whiskey. And that's so cool. It was a thing we didn't quite know whether it would catch on, but only after we released it was I like, oh, this is, like Tennessee whiskey. It's just we're just making bourbon in Tennessee. And that's gonna by calling it Tennessee whiskey, by giving it this. Yeah, actually, if you turn the bottle, it has the Empire Rye seal on it.
Oh, cool!
This mark of authenticity that all of the Empire Rye whiskeys carry. So cool. If you see that on the bottle, it was distilled in New York. The grain, at least 75% of the grain was grown in New York.
I love standards.
Yeah. I mean, I sort of was like, why? This is just standards for the sake of standards. But no, I was dead wrong. I mean, this is actually like a really meaningful way for the New York distillers to come together to advocate for rye whiskey, which is, again, like 1 out of 50 bottles is a rye whiskey.
Wow.
And that is crazy, because rye is good. It's really good.
Bourbon
is, I would argue, pretty boring and homogenous. That's not to say that there's not some good ones, and I love bourbon, but there's so much more variety in rye. And actually, rye shows, if you look at where rye is today, you can start to imagine where bourbon's going to be in about 8 years, and it gets really cool. It gets really awesome to imagine that if bourbon becomes that differentiated and with that much variety, it's going to be a really great time for drinkers. I don't know it'll be the best time for distillers, but
I've got a peated rye on the way to me right now.
Yeah, exactly. Good, great. Yeah.
Are there many other distilleries that have products that qualify for the Empire Rye distinction?
I think there's probably at least 20 in New York State that have committed. Either they've released or they've committed to releasing an Empire Rye, meaning they have it in the warehouse, but it's not in the bottle.
Were there any aging standards around Empire
Rye? Just the 2-year for straight rye whiskey.
Minimum.
But No, because we knew that it was going to be, we wanted to be a sort of standard entry, let's say.
Yeah.
We didn't want it to be a 0-year thing to rule out that kind of very low quality. But rye, in general, people are accepting of a younger rye than a younger bourbon.
Yeah.
And so we kind of let that lead. But I should also say the commission is an entity that is flexible, and we may change our rules at some point to further protect Empire Rye if we feel like it's helpful to do so.
That's cool.
So I do work with that group pretty closely because I very much believe in rye whiskey. I mean, as a Kentuckian and a bourbon drinker, pretty exclusively, I find that you're much more likely to get an interesting bottle if you go for rye than for bourbon. And that's true even of the big guys. That's true of even the new sort of what I'm calling middle range or new traditional distillers like Castle and Key, Bardstown, New Riff, Willett. A lot of the stuff coming out from those guys that's interesting is their rye, perhaps because
100%.
Again, it just, you can get something, 6-year rye can be gorgeous. 6-year bourbon is like your pretty basic bourbon,
Right.
So
I've had a 7-year Willett that blew my friggin' mind.
Was it a rye or bourbon?
Rye.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
But that's the thing. So imagine all of these distillers. I mean, many of them are about 6 to 10 years old, but meaning that a lot of their available inventory is probably going to be on the younger side. So it's just pointing to this future where really the golden age of bourbon is ahead of us. And the irony is that most people will have moved on to be drinking tequila because silver tequila, $250 silver tequila.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So,
go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. No, I was saying, I don't know if you mentioned the title of your book or your recent book, because you've written a few. Is the Kings County Distillery, The Bourbon Drinker's Companion, a guide to American distilleries. Oh, he's got it right there, with travel advice, folklore, and tasting notes by Colin Spoelman. So check it out. It just got released last week. Brian bought it, read at least 43 pages of it. And,
I'm more like 80 now, buddy.
Oh, nice. But I can't read good. But I do.
I'll just say there's a lot of pictures.
Oh, good.
I like your
pictures and graphics. So
infographics and little tags of like, when he talks about a particular bottling or he'll give like badges to it of like, I think this one is quality. I think this one is value and things like that. It's good. It's easy to absorb. It's good.
But does it have math?
No, it does not.
No,
this is all you want now, I realized.
No, I specifically avoided numerical ratings because
I love it.
That's
great.
Nothing stupider than that. But from a distiller's perspective, I understand.
Right.
Was there whiskey advocate's got to do what whiskey advocate does got to do?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Was there any particular, as a last sentiment here, any particular trip or visit that you went on that sticks out in your mind? Like, man, I had so much fun when I was there.
Yeah. What's one of your top moments?
Well, there was, the book took a long time, but there was a moment where I was like, I haven't been to San Francisco. There's a couple distilleries I got to visit there.
Yeah.
And the last distillery I visited, actually the last two, were the oldest distilleries, craft distilleries in the country. St. George and Charbet, and man, those were really cool. I just have to say, like,
awesome.
There's if you're a Kentucky bourbon drinker and you go way to the West Coast, and it's just a different mentality about kind of everything. Yeah. And their approach to whiskey is so different and so open and flexible, and Charbet is like in a garage. It's like
is it legal? Is it legal?
Yeah. No, but it's and they have this cognac still.
Nice.
Which nobody's making whiskey in a cognac still.
Yeah.
So there was just so much about it that was cool, and yet here it sits in 2 hours north of San Francisco in this like kind of weed smoking town, weed growing town, Mendocino County. And Talking to the distiller there, who's kind of as part of his, he is, more credible of the distilling family legacy than Jim Beam. He just, his family goes to Eastern Europe. And so it was a pretty fun trip and very, I think, fitting to sort of end the book that way, because it just was such a departure from everything I started with. I started with Kentucky bourbon and Woodford Reserve, and you end with like hopped whiskeys distilled from 7 different beers that were just consolidated into a tanker truck.
That's fun.
And then distilled in a cognac still. I mean, just you're crazy. You're crazy. Cool. And then I'm sitting there with the distiller who's, pouring me samples of their family's brandy, the oldest American spirit I've ever put in my body, like
that's
27-year-old American brandy.
Dang.
Nice.
And, he's like, okay, pour that on the floor. It's like, on to the next. Yeah, and
that's funny.
It went that way for quite a while. So
that's cool.
Yeah. That was
I love it.
Yeah, that's cool.
Well, as we close out, we're really grateful to have you on, Colin. And I hope our listeners can check your books out, as well as check Kings County out, Brooklyn, New York, oldest New York City distillery we got. But I also hope that we can have you on in the future.
I hope that our listeners can grab one of the 24 bottles left of the Peated Rye.
Nice.
Right.
You hoping for anything, Colin?
I'm hoping, that people continue to drink whiskey.
Heck yeah.
I think there is this moment where people are like distracted by RTDs and tequila or agave spirits. No, I hope, this is what I hope for, that me and our peers, and I mean peers, I mean Kentucky bourbon, and I mean little distillers around the country, continue to sort of we get to see the fruits of this sort of boom in American whiskey actually yield the whiskeys that people have been clamoring for the whole time. I think to some extent, like, the boom happened and all the aged whiskeys dried up, and we were like, oh, this is what people want. We're going to start making whiskeys for that. And we're not there yet. Like, we haven't been able to release those whiskeys. So, we do run the risk that people just lose interest before we even get there.
That's true.
Yeah.
Not this guy.
I was going to say.
We'll keep repping, especially for the smaller distilleries.
Yeah, we got to keep doing what we're doing, and I think we'll be okay. But there are distillers already in the book that are not out of business, but they're having some tough times. So
totally,
I hope they make it.
Yes, I hope they make it. I hope, I got a lot of them. I hope people continue to support small distillers, because that dollar is more meaningful in that way. And I hope people stay enthusiastic about American whiskey, drinking American whiskey, collecting American whiskey, reading about American whiskey, all that.
Yeah, I hope so too. Yeah. Thank you, Colin. And most of all, listeners, I hope that our love of whiskey lifted your spirits.
John's?